Russia, within a couple of years, feels emboldened to take on a NATO by attacking a NATO country such as Latvia because they believe that the United States is not really committed or caring.
It's my absolute pleasure to be joined once again by Ben Hodges, who is a retired United States Army officer. He became commander of United States Army Europe in November 2014 and held that position for 3 years until retiring from the Army in January 2018. Until recently, he was the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Centre for European Policy Analysis, specialising in NATO, transatlantic relationships, and international security. And of course, now he has his work cut out because we not only have the largest full-scale war happening on the territory of Europe since World War II, we also have the US descending into something that resembles a form of tyranny with features that are certainly familiar to me, having studied Putin's rise to power. And today we're going to talk about a variety of things. One of them, I think, is absolutely significant, and that is the fact that Russia attacked EU and UK assets in Ukraine yesterday, and that is just a week after it was striking US investments. Will there be any cost to pay whatsoever for Putin's aggression against the world? Ben, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
And this is a discussion of Ukraine. But of course, these are all intertwined and sort of Trump's actions. And I'm going to start with a fairly punchy statement. You've described in the end of the sort of previous conversation a very sort of very tactical, very reactive kind of Trump administration. You know, they get the glimmerings of a strategy, and then 2 days later it's reversed. So there's no real sort of consistency there. There's no depth, there's no context. It's just constant sort of chaotic change, it seems, at least on the surface. There's some stuff, behind the scenes, there seems to be a little bit more when it comes to dismantling, checks and balances in the US. There's something a little more concerted there, probably driven by other people. Putin also, it turns out, is extremely tactical and not particularly strategic. And when it comes to big strategic decisions, he tends to put them off and off and off, opting for sort of tactical things. Against a weakened West, that has got him a long way, unfortunately. But if you have these two really rather sort of chaotic, aggressive forces, Trump and Putin, acting in such a tactical way, this reminds me a little bit, maybe even of the First World War, where you inadvertently slide into something like World War III. You don't mean to, but there is a mechanic that drives their behaviors continuously to a form of escalation, which leads you to that point. Do you think Trump's behavior makes World War III more rather than less likely?
Um, I think I'm not prepared to say that, but I am prepared to say that his failure to support Ukraine and to even call Russia the aggressor is number one, increasing the chances that Ukraine eventually fails, unless Europe really can fill that gap. And therefore, Russia, within a couple of years, feels emboldened to take on a NATO by attacking a NATO country such as Latvia because they believe that the United States is not really committed or caring. So it could happen like that. But also that the Chinese watch and they see that the Trump administration appears to be pretty flexible on this sovereignty thing, and that they may feel emboldened, and then they see a divided United States that is no longer has allies because of how we've treated our allies. Um, so this reveals that once again that lack of strategic thinking and the consequences, which is why I think it is so important that Europe begin to act like the third superpower it uh, can and should be. When you add together the collective industries and technological advantages, the populations, the economic wealth, and nuclear weapons, if collectively that dwarfs Russia. And of course, when I speak of Europe in this context, I'm not talking about the EU. I'm talking about all of Europe, including UK and also Canada. So if you can get the political will for nations to work together, I'm not talking about, forming United States of Europe or something like that. I'm talking about you have the same strategic interest, almost every country, which is protecting your people, protecting the so-called international rules-based order that the U.S. has stepped away from.
It's not been talked in this context, but it strikes me that attacks on US investments on EU diplomatic territory in Ukraine, we've been looking out and wondering when Russia would try a sub-threshold attack, no attack just below triggering of Article 5. It seems to me that the attacks we've seen in the last 2 weeks are on a kind of path of something that will lead to eventually a test of an Article 5 to see whether Europe has the backing of the US, to see whether Europe has the unity to actually respond to a full Article 5 attack. But this is a stepping stone, and I'm not sure people are really joining the dots on this.
You're right, Jonathan. I think that uh, people still look at what happens in the Baltic Sea, for example, these attacks on infrastructure or the constant airspace violations or Russian missiles and drones landing inside Poland and Romania and Latvia. It happens so much that these are not one-off incidents or accidents. And not to mention the other sabotage and attacks and attempted assassinations that have happened across Europe. And of course, the well-known disinformation. The Russians are at war with us, even if we don't think of it as being at war, because we assume war is only when you have missiles and submarines and attacks and all of these things happening, versus all these activities that you and I have talked about. Um, and I think that our leaders should talk about it in that way, that of course we're at war with Russia. Whether or not it turns kinetic, fully kinetic, depends on how we respond. And I think the Russians are steadily uh, pushing that to find where that limit is. I spoke to a Dutch friend, he's retired now, but was a very senior official in the government of the Netherlands, former military, and I said, why don't we seize these Russian vessels or the so-called shadow fleet vessels, even if they have a flag from some other crazy place? We know what they are. Why don't we seize them? He goes, well, the Netherlands, we see ourselves as the beacon of international law, the international criminal courts here. So that would be illegal in international water. Well, okay, that's where they are. And the Russians, of course, know that.
That's right. It's an extraordinary sort of weakness, and many of these vessels don't have the appropriate
Of
insurance,
course,
so
no.
legal grounds could be found. Now, other things, interesting things are happening. We often focus on, well, we focus unfortunately on Trump and the noise he produces, but a lot of Ukraine's successes, as has been the case over 4 years, doesn't get the full press it deserves. And we're seeing some incredible developments with the Flamingo missile. We've got the sort of UAV interceptors to intercept, Russian drones. We focus on the ones that get through, of course, but Ukraine has been extraordinary at actually intercepting and preventing the majority of Russian missiles and drones getting through. This leads me to another piece of wild speculation, and that is that we are now seeing something that I'm starting to call the siege of Moscow beginning. And it's not like a sort of traditional World War II type siege or a medieval siege, but Moscow is a consumer of vast amounts of resources with intense logistics. It's the centerpiece of Russian governance, population, and most of the wealth is there, but almost none of the wealth is produced there. It seems to me Ukraine, if they're going to win, and they're very smart. I think they're sort of gearing up to do this. They're looking to cut Moscow off from its resources, strangle the regime, and essentially starve it out. And what that leads to, who knows? More likely a coup, perhaps. Do you think it's wild to start thinking of it in those terms, or might Ukraine be thinking along these lines?
So that's an interesting formulation. I haven't thought of it in terms of a siege of Moscow. Uh, and I don't know. I mean, that would require some work before Europeans, particularly Germans, could be okay with that kind of language. I mean, they've tried that. Um, but I do believe you've put your finger on something that in the past, Russia's part of its strength was its vastness. I mean, they could, every czar and even Stalin could absorb invaders, just keep going back and then attack. That now, because of Ukraine's development of long-range precision strike capabilities, uh, is a vulnerability because Russia clearly cannot protect. There's not enough air defense on the planet to protect every refinery, every pumping station, every part of that oil and gas infrastructure. And that is the oxygen for the Kremlin, is the resources that they generate with their export of oil and gas. And so if we're not going to do the job by stopping them intercepting all of these shadow fleet vessels, if we're not going to do it by putting enough pressure on China and India and even Turkey, countries that are buying the Russian oil and gas, then the Ukrainians are going to do it through kinetic means. And I think they're up over, I've seen 14%, 17% reduction. I mean, any business in UK that had a 14% reduction in that would be devastating. And so I think they're onto it, but also what the GUR does so very well. They're like the Mossad, and I think probably most senior Russian officers and maybe some civilian officials, but especially within the military in Russia, for the rest of their life, they're going to be looking over their shoulder and checking under their car because GUR is going to make them pay for what they have done. If they were anywhere in that chain of command responsible for missile attacks that killed Ukrainian civilians or killed Ukrainians in Bucha and Mariupol and places like that.
I mean, they're going to be looking out for their own guys as well, punishing them for failure. So I think that's a double layer of paranoia there.
Yeah.
Another thing that perhaps has not really been, joined the dots on is, of course, we had the farcical summit in Alaska. It was cut short. I haven't heard any really credible evidence of why it was cut short and why the meal that was scheduled didn't happen. And then someone accidentally left the meal plan on the photocopier. I'm sure that wasn't accidental at all. So I won't speculate about that. But what we do have following the summit is more hollow deadlines. That's just sort of smoke and mirrors. There's nothing going on there. But we do have a withdrawal of certain weapon systems which had been approved for Ukraine. We have potentially withdrawal of intelligence data yet again. It seems that behind the scenes there is a stepping back from support for Ukraine, which in these circumstances is implicitly not neutrality, it is support for the aggressor in my mind. So what do you think is going on here? Is actually Alaska, the whole point of it was to actually understand what Putin needs so that his regime doesn't collapse. And now the US seems to be complying with things that are deeply beneficial to the aggressor.
It certainly looks that way. And that's what I meant earlier when I said that, while Trump may not be a Russian asset in the traditional sense, the effect of him as an asset is there in those things you just discussed. The And I think the Ukrainians have realized this now for some time. And I also think this is why the European leaders joined President Zelensky at the White House back a couple of weeks ago, because they absolutely do not trust President Trump. And they were there, I think, actually to protect Zelensky as much as possible and to send a message that Europe, as imperfect as it is so far, is coming together. And President Macron said something that I thought was so valuable when President Trump went around the table and he said, we're going to have a Putin and Zelensky are going to have a bilat and then we'll have a trilat. And then Macron said, well, we actually need a quadrilat because this is about Europe's security as well. I was impressed by him, actually by the whole gathering, but especially what President Macron had to say. And so I think Europe, fortunately, is finally waking up to the fact that the Trump administration is not going to follow through on any of the threats it's said. Now, the fact that the spokeswoman is trying to both sides the bombings, that's they're consistently that way. I don't know how Secretary Rubio can even look at himself in the morning. This is a guy, longtime, strong Republican, pro-NATO, pro-transatlantic, uh, a Cuban refugee, or son of a Cuban refugees. How he can even say what he has to say unless he has completely sold his soul.
Yeah, and in some of the meetings, he looks distinctly uncomfortable. I think he has a
Yes.
consciousness about what he's doing, which makes it in some ways even worse. We've just got a couple of minutes left, and it seems that, and someone actually in the audience, asked me to ask this question of somebody, and this is the ideal opportunity. It seems Europe is or was waiting for a backstop that never comes. They are looking for a consensus with the US, looking for the US to come back on side and for normality to resume. That is not going to happen. Is it not the case that no one's going to come and save Europe this time? If we don't help save Ukraine and ourselves, that there's not going to be a sort of US in shining armor coming to restore democracy, coming to restore rule of law. Either we fix it or it's done.
Unfortunately, I think that's true. I don't see anything happening with this administration over the next 3 years that makes me think, they're finally going to get it and then they'll be back and we'll get this all sorted. Um, So, no, I don't see that happening. And of course, if they're successful in undermining midterm elections and other things, a lot of people are already starting to realize that Trump's goal is not to leave office at the end of his term, but to, through a variety of manufactured crises, remain in power. Um, so, if I'm a strategic planner in any European capital, my course of action one is, of course, the United States wakes up from its, nightmare and it gets back in action. Course of action two is no U.S. help. Russia is coming, and they are going to continue undermining all the things that Europe holds dear until the Russians feel like they're ready to attack and end NATO once and for all because the alliance fails to respond. So I think it's for me when I look at the industry, the economy, the wealth, the populations, all the things that Europe has in total, but it's not acting collectively. It's very frustrating because you should be able to Europe by itself should be able to shut down Russia. Yeah, of course, you don't have 10,000 nuclear weapons, but you don't need 10,000 nuclear weapons. What you need is the ability to shut down Russia's ability to generate resources to keep the war going and to keep the oligarchs in power. And they're the ones that keep Putin in power. And I think there's too many holes in sanctions. You've got Greek ships, an EU country, Greek ships that are helping to carry Russian oil. You've got Turkey, a NATO member, buying Russian oil. Obviously, Hungary and Slovakia, that's well known, but that's not a quantity that's so significant. I mean, there are things that could be done. I thought President Stubb has been very forthright about what needs to be done. He's not confused about who the bad guys are up in Finland. And he has tried to organize some collective efforts of Baltic Sea nations, which includes Germany, Poland, Denmark, obviously, as well as Sweden and Finland and the three Baltic states, to take action against what Russia is doing up there. So maybe it's sub-regional efforts in the Baltic Sea, in the Arctic, in the Black Sea region, versus trying to get one perfectly managed counter. Um, but if Ukraine fails, that's 1 or 2 million more Ukrainian refugees pouring into Central and Western Europe. Continued disruption of oil and gas and food that's needed around the world. And
Could be
I
a lot
think,
more. It could be, up to 20 million actually if the population decamps on mass.
yeah.
The
And
very
of course, the Russians will absorb tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops that will be forced into the Red Army. So there's a lot of problems if there's failure. And I know I've heard almost every single European leader talk about this. So it's not like anybody's going to be caught by surprise.
And indeed, the head of NATO has said that if China invades Taiwan, then it's highly likely that Russia will have complete impunity to commit that Article 5 challenge, and NATO will be defunct, and then all hell breaks loose. So I think there's an awareness of what the worst case scenarios are, but no preparation towards it. Very, very last one. Should we now consider closing the skies over Ukraine as a more punchy strategy to try and deal with Russia?
Well, I'm 100% in favor of that, but what does that actually mean? That means that we've got to put our pilots up as well as our air defense systems either inside Ukraine or do as much as you can from inside Polish airspace, Romanian airspace, Lithuanian airspace, um, and try to shoot down incoming Russian missiles and drones the way that we do for Israel and the way that we do over the Red Sea to protect international shipping from the Houthis. So the technology is certainly there, but you got to be prepared. If you're going to have a Royal Air Force pilot or an American pilot or a German pilot up in the sky, if they're are they going to shoot at unmanned systems or would they engage a Russian aircraft? Okay. Secondly, you have to assume that Russian air defense, whether it's in Russian controlled parts of Ukraine or inside Russia, if a radar from one of those systems locks on one of our pilots, they have to be able to shoot back immediately. So suppression of enemy air defense, and then you have to assume that at some point um, one of our aircraft will be hit, and a pilot will eject, and they'll float to the ground and perhaps land inside Russian controlled territory or in Russia. Are we prepared to go in and get them? So these are the kind of details that are really important if we want to have an effective sky shield of some sort that's integrated into what the Ukrainians are doing. It's more than just giving them more Patriot.
This is a topic we'll need to pursue. I know we have to end it there. Ben, thank you so much for generously appearing on the show once again in this sort of two-part episode that we're going to split it into. And I look forward to the next time.
Thanks very much. Me too, Jonathan.